Hi there. This is an analysis of the new costumes in the Game of Thrones prequel, House of the Dragon, which is set 200 years before the original series and has an entirely new costume designer, Tamim, major award-winning costume designer on a couple of major franchises. What sort of paradigm shift could we expect from this new costumer? You've all been asking that. Well, we got two new costumes of note in the first promo pics that they put out, Rhaenyra and Alicent, who are the respective heads of the two rival political factions in the Dance of the Dragons. They're the trendsetters for their followers. The entire reason the factions in the Civil War get nicknamed the Blacks and the Greens is because Rhaenyra likes wearing Targaryen black from their heraldry, while Alicent just likes wearing green. So everybody copies their styles. The faction leaders are the trendsetters. It's described that way in the books, but even then the books don't exactly describe the specific structure of those styles. What do they look like? Do they have long sleeves, short sleeves? Do they lace up the front or the back? What exactly do these look like? Martin never really describes costumes in that much detail to translate into something visual. It's not elaborated on in the books. So Tamim had to develop these two trendsetters in an entirely different time period. And we fans have been trying to figure it out the past couple of weeks on forums and social media discussion. What exactly was she going for with these two promo pics that we have, which, is a small sampling, but it's what we have now. At first, I couldn't make heads or tails of it, to be honest. It's different. But what exactly is it measurably? Then I realized that Alicent looks a lot like Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, who, incidentally, Natalie Dormer played in the Tudor show. So at first, I thought Alicent dresses in Tudor fashion. That's wrong. Thought that until other fans who know a lot more about historical costuming than I do pointed out to me that there's actually several key differences between Alicent Hightower's style and Tudor style. What Alicent is wearing mixes and matches features from a few different eras. Real historical eras, but they're mixed and matched. So I did more research, and in so doing, I was in turn able to figure out how Rhaenyra's costume fits into this, putting it in opposition to Alicent's. The key was that, unlike Michelle Clapton on Game of Thrones, Tamim isn't pushing for totally unique fantasy designs, but making costumes strongly influenced by real-life historical designs, but mixing up features here and there. I made a previous video profile on Tamim when she was first announced, and you should check that out, how she actually, in all the projects she's been working on, wants to make a big push towards realistic costumes. She's famous for Harry Potter, and if you haven't heard anything about this, she's the Harry Potter lady. She actually came into Harry Potter starting in the third movie. Similarly, she designed some costumes for 2 James Bond movies, but that was a long-running franchise before she came into it. And she's worked actually on major movies like Children of Men. That's the big one that the showrunner cited. We have the costumer and production designer from Children of Men on this. But reading through her interviews and stuff for Harry Potter, for James Bond, for other stuff, she always talks about she wants a grounded approach, not fantastical designs. That, some of these James Bond costumes, there's no way the female lead could run in this thing. Versus, she's not opposed to sexy costumes. She said, I want something that you could plausibly run and shoot in and actually move around, not something ridiculous. And that's how you notice, like in Harry Potter, starting in the third movie, they start wearing civilian clothing a little more. Now, she had to work with what they had already designed in the first 2 movies, but she made this, what she's famous for is, I'm the person pushing for realism. That she wants a grounded approach, not fantastical designs for the sake of fantastical, which has its place, but it's a different take on it. So, given that she's the realism champion, what could we expect in this new project on House of the Dragon? The one guideline we had vaguely is that in one of his first interviews, new showrunner Ryan Condal said that when it comes to props and costumes and just set design like a chair or a table or whatever, they generally want things to look like they could exist in the same universe as Game of Thrones. Visually, it's hard to describe the visual texture of it, but they weren't going for a soft reboot. He said, we want things to generally look like they could exist in the same universe, though, of course, costume-wise, these are entirely different characters, so their personal styles will be different. Like, not all historical Lannisters across the past 300 years since the Targaryen conquest dressed like Cersei Lannister specifically on this scale of centuries. That they're individuals, that they're specific people like that. But there's still wiggle room in there where he's saying, well, we don't want it to look that different, but Tamim has a different philosophy to this than Michelle Clapton does. And I don't want too much yelling in the comments about this. I really like and appreciate the effort that Michelle Clapton put into her designs. That she made an artistic choice. I'm trying to make unique designs for this alternate fantasy world. It doesn't need to be a retread of our historical medieval designs. And that was also a criticism going around when the show started, if you don't remember, that some people go, oh, it's just going to look like yet another Renaissance fair thing. That they wanted it to look unique to set it apart, that this isn't just another low-budget thing. And I get that there's the argument for everything of, do we go with something new, or do we go with the established stuff? Because if you go with the established stuff, people call it boring. If you go with something new, people call it too experimental. There is no one right answer, guys. And generally, I really like the amount of thought that Clapton put into it about how characters' designs have a ripple effect across society because the heads of the great houses are the trendsetters, and how people imitate how they dress, how she planned out story arcs for, years in advance. This is how Marjorie Tyrell's costumes are going to change over time as the fashions change. This is how Sansa's going to change. How Daenerys changed. Because I've read through all this. I wrote up most of the costumes section on Game of Thrones Wiki. Just this database of all the quotes she made, because unlike how, the showrunners didn't really tell us a lot of their creative decisions, even if you disagreed with the decision Clapton made, she would explain in an interview, this is why I did this. This is the thought I put into it. So I respect all that, the thought she put into it. I made a database of all of her notes. And I really like a lot of her designs. Some of this stuff, like the Marjorie stuff, the Daenerys blue costume from Season 3, these are really iconic costumes now, which aren't really medieval. A specific medieval real-life design. That real medieval people didn't look the way that Marjorie or Cersei or Daenerys do. Argument both ways. I can see that. But maybe it's time to go for something a little more grounded after the really unique stuff. I don't know which one's the right answer, but Clapton was going for, on the spectrum, she wanted to go for unique stuff. Tamim wants to do what's arguably harder, which is go with stuff that's based on real life historical fashions without being boring about it. That don't just directly copy, okay, she dresses like Anne Boleyn. That no, she actually thought out and mixed and matched how things are going to look in this while still going for something grounded. And which really impressed me when I realized it's not just a direct copy, she did something very interesting here, but within that framework of, it has to be bits and pieces from historical things. Like one part of the dress is a real historical cut, but the other part is from a different time period. Spy photos only really gave us a clear look of what Rhaenyra was wearing. We never got one for Alicent, and it doesn't matter because the same Rhaenyra costume we then got a clear look at in the official promo photo. So there were no real spy photos of other stuff that we could really use. All we really have are their 3 official promo pics. And the men in these dress pretty much functionally. You could talk about this, but it's subtle stuff that I know you guys wouldn't be excited about. The real hero here is, what are the queens wearing? That's the big costuming thing. That the men are dressed pretty much functionally, doublets and so forth. The 2 standout designs were Rhaenyra Targaryen from her official promo pic, and Alicent Hightower from her official promo pic. Therefore, for this video, I'm only going to focus on these two. This is a Rhaenyra versus Alicent video. These promo pics came out first week of May, and fans have been discussing them ever since. This may surprise you, but while I do hold a degree in medieval history, I don't know anything about medieval fashion. That just because you have a medieval degree doesn't mean you knew the entire era. Like, I focused on political stuff. That doesn't mean I know costuming or poetry or every aspect of their society or specific theological debates. I know some of them, I don't know all of them. You get a general grounding in some of it, and then my focus was the political stuff. I really just, when in discussing the wars between Britain and France or something in political power, they discuss, by the way, this is what fashions were in this time period. Doesn't really come up in the textbook. So all this is actually interesting to me because they're extra details about the overall medieval society that I have been reading about for all these years, but just I never really looked up what medieval fashions were like. It's fun to learn this. Much as, it's fun to, like, when you go to a reenactment or something, they go, this is how you actually make a shield by hand. Have you ever been to a Renaissance thing or a sci-fi convention where someone's like doing real blacksmithing by hand and showing this is the method we use to do that? And it's little things like this is I'm making a horseshoe or something, or this is how the shield goes together, but it's little details like that that are part of the overall world building. You've seen that with my channel. I'll do an investigation on, this is what medieval food was like, or some other aspect of their culture. Well, this is what their concept of race was like, because I didn't really research all of this when I was in grad school, that there's always something new to learn to add another layer to our understanding of this different society. The thing is, when you study something, you don't finish. You're always learning more, and that's the point. That when you're a scholar, that doesn't mean I soaked up everything like a sponge and now I'm just going to regurgitate it. It means they trained you how to research things on your own, how to have that analytical method and compiling things and just having the experience of, I need to research this more and delivering a report on it. That, any scholar that tries to be, I'm an expert on everything, I don't pretend to be an expert. The point is, I'm willing to put in the effort to do the research. You've seen that with my channel. It's always, you're researching new stuff. That I don't sit around trying to guess, why did the writers make these decisions with, no evidence to go on other than my own opinion? That I spend hours and hours researching their Blu-ray commentaries and obscure interviews and cross-reference them. And yeah, people go, you're still reading your own stuff into it. Just when people just have, it's so weird when I see YouTube videos that are just reaction videos. Like, if you have a reaction video to, this is what I think they're doing with their costuming, if it's someone who has no experience in costuming, like one of those real, it's a reaction video, they go, I like that it's red. Versus you can say, read up a couple of articles on, well, this is what medieval fashion was like, this is how they're comparing and contrasting that. And I hope that's why my channel has some longevity to it, some depth that'll get people to actually want to come back by subscribing. Click subscribe if you haven't already. Is I'm actually presenting the research I did to you instead of just, wow, I think that looks pretty, with no new information to provide you. I'm trying to provide information, not just yet another commentary. So why this take so long, even though this came out right at the beginning of May? Because I've been spending the past few weeks researching some of the basics about medieval fashion, because I didn't know a lot about it. So I sat down and put in the effort to read up on, this is what medieval fashion was between these different time periods. What all this is leading up to is that originally I wanted to make a gigantic 3-hour-long video scrutinizing the new costumes in detail. But I realized this is impossible for 2 reasons. First, I don't know enough about medieval fashion yet to give you an analysis project quite that detailed. But that ties into point 2. We don't have that much evidence to go on. We have 2 costumes. Rhaenyra and Alicent, the only ones of note. And the Alicent one doesn't even show her full outfit. It's just a head profile. We can see her neckline and stuff. We can't see most of her gown. Like, what are the sleeves like? How does it lace up the front or the back or something? You can't see what's there. Does she have some sort of hoop skirt, or is it falling naturally? We can't see that much of what Alicent is wearing. So I was beating myself up over it's not the definitive video yet. The definitive video will come after season 1 airs when we see every costume. So combination of limited evidence with, I am not an expert yet. There's still a lot of research I need to do. Stop beating myself up about it. I realized rather than a huge definitive 3-hour video on everything and everyone, focus in on a shorter video on just comparing Rhaenyra and Alicent as best I can based on just these 2 photos. And I might put out more when trailers come out. When you see me giving a trailer reaction video, that'll be one of my things picking it apart is, what are these costume designs like? Because, it's like picking apart the set design. It's not like I'm not in a position to make costumes on my own. It's just as a design choice. Oh, this is the design they chose for that character as part of their thing. It's like comparing stormtrooper armor designs for me. I mean, the whole costume database started out as just I needed somewhere to put notes of where Clapton said, well, the Lannisters wear more metal armor because they're richer and specifically have a lot of mines. The Starks don't wear as much metal because they're from a relatively poor kingdom and can't afford it. This started out as a thing about military costumes, and, she ended up talking more and more about the fashions worn by the noblewomen at the royal court, so I kept adding that to the costumes database on the wiki there. And it grew from there. It took me like half a year to make the original one. And I'm going to make a new costumes thing on the wiki for all the House of the Dragon stuff. Now we have new designers and everything. So this isn't the work of one big definitive 3-hour video. This is going to be an ongoing series as we get stuff not to be finished until we actually get season 1 airing. And I still want to put something out now when we're still just picking apart the promo stuff. That's what this video is. I felt something should come out. I'm getting a lot of help and advice from other people who know more about medieval fashion than I do. Costume Co., who has her own big YouTube costume analysis channel. Heather. Xenon Faye really helped me a lot as well. I'll talk about that more. I put some of her notes into this. They gave me advice, pointed me towards other resources and PDF books, and they're the ones that pointed out to me, Alicent isn't really dressed exactly like Anne Boleyn during the Tudor era. It's all these new designs. So how I'm going to approach this is, first I'm going to give a brief summary of all the research I did. Very broadly, some of the major features of different historical eras. Then I'll go over Alicent and Rhaenyra's costumes, which will go a lot quicker that way, to demonstrate this is how Tamim mixed and matched a few elements from these different eras. Most of this is going over the eras, and that's just, well, here's part A, part B, part C on her dress there, and you can see how it's all put together. How do we define these different eras? That's a question. Broadest definition is that before the year 1000, you had the early Middle Ages, which I'm not going to cover in this because they were different. And after the year 1000, you generally had the High Middle Ages, from about 1000 to 1350, the flowering of medieval society. After 1350-ish, you have the Late Middle Ages. The divide between the High and Late Middle Ages is the Black Death. That was a huge chapter break, had all sorts of long-term ripple effects on society. Late Middle Ages lasted from around 1350-ish to about 1500 or so. Then after 1500, we get into the Reformation era, Protestant Reformation. Americas were discovered and all of that. 1500 is usually seen as the dividing line between medieval and modern history. An issue is that in the early medieval era, fashion was limited to the aristocracy, who dressed largely the same across most of Europe. But as history progressed with rising wealth, new middle classes, and more clearly defined political borders, fashion started diversifying a lot more. So while I can point to general features of the High Middle Ages versus Late Middle Ages across all of Western Europe, things diversified so much after 1500 that things got fuzzier. So when I was discussing this with all the other costuming fans, I was struggling over what to even call this third period of the three periods I'm going to look at. Do I call it the Renaissance? The Renaissance happened to Southern Europe decades before Northern Europe. And by 1500, it wasn't even really the Renaissance anymore. It was the Reformation. Ultimately, we decided that because Westeros is a fantasy version of Britain, it makes sense to go by the royal dynasty era specific to Britain. In this case, British fashion in the 1500s is called Tudor era. So I will refer to everything from 1500 to 1600 as the Tudor era. After that, it goes on into early modern styles I won't get into here. Point of all of this is to keep in mind that when I say Tudor era, Italy didn't have a Tudor era that exactly matches up to this. It's not even, well, they call it something else. No, they had a different time period that doesn't exactly overlap. And their styles might be entirely different due to a warmer climate or local political trends. They wouldn't call it the Tudor era. It doesn't even chronologically match up. In some cases, some of these other countries were wearing entirely different things. But we're based on British history here, so I'm going with Tudor to ground it there, center it. But not every region of Europe was the same, particularly in this third era, which you could alternatively call the Reformation era. But when we say Reformation-era costumes, that encompasses a number of different styles across Western Europe, which were not uniform anymore. Keep that in mind, because I'm going to come back to it later. So we've established that for this analysis, we're going through three time periods. High Middle Ages, Late Middle Ages, and Tudor/Reformation. I actually want to keep things simple and easy to grasp, so I set out to break down the major style features of each of these three eras into a checklist, just an easy-to-read checklist, because I want this to be educational at an introductory level. I want people with no prior knowledge of historical fashions to be able to walk away from this video grasping a few basic points. And the fewer points I make, the easier it is to remember. So I'm not making this for the really high level, this is how to make one of these things on your own. I'm going over basic terminology, basic outlines of this is what people looked like in a given century. So the fewer points I make, the easier it is to grasp. So I broke it down into only three major factors to make it easy to remember. These three factors are headgear, neckline, and waistline. Nothing about materials or production styles, just so you could recognize a style at a glance if you saw it on TV. So we've got three factors across three time periods, right? Easy enough. So let's start with High Middle Ages, which I'll tell you right now, none of the House of the Dragon costumes are imitating High Middle Ages. I'm including it here just to give a sense of how fashion changed over time. And because this is the era I myself focus on. I focus on France around 1200, the life of Philip Augustus. Also because this is the time period back in like the 1130s and stuff, when the anarchy was happening between Matilda and Stephen in England, which is actually what the Dance of the Dragons is based on, but I'll get back to that later. But these costumes from the TV show do not look High Middle Ages at all. But just as a template for when we're talking about the other eras, what did these three factors look like in the High Middle Ages, these three features? Headgear was often a barbet, which is sort of a cowl that includes a chin strap. Or, alternatively, a wimple, like a nun's wimple, which covers the entire head. Both of these often had a veil attached that covered the hair falling down the back. Aristocratic women would, of course, often embellish these by wearing metal circlets in their hair. Not a huge crown, but like a circlet as jewelry. Also keep in mind that I'm going over the way that noble women dressed, which is different from how commoners dressed, and there is a distinction, but because I'm talking about Rhaenyra and Alicent, I'm focusing on the top end of the fashion spectrum. That when I say, oh, and of course they had the jewelry in their hair, common workers and farmers wouldn't, but that's obvious. So headgear, it was this simple wimple or a cowl with a chin strap called a barbette. Neckline was actually pretty simple because it was often just covered by the wimple. They didn't really have a neckline as such. It was either fully covered by the wimple or be a veil wrapped around it like a scarf. The neck and collarbones were usually covered, though sometimes the veil was transparent. But even when they had a neckline with this, it was simple. When it wasn't covered, it's described as just wide and shallow, scooped and rounded. So a shallow, rounded one, you wouldn't really see the collarbones. It was pretty simple. Clothes were generally loose and practical in the High Middle Ages. They just started being made of finer materials, but not going to get into that. The waistline, third factor here, the waistline was low. That is, naturally following the line of the hips. Let me show some other pictures here. Here's Katharine Hepburn as Eleanor of Aquitaine in The Lion in Winter, plus a drawing of a noblewoman in the High Middle Ages. Now, I mixed up sometimes real medieval art, sometimes I'm going to use photos of recreation medieval costumes from movies, which I think illustrate the point I'm trying to make reasonably well. So I'll cover these each individually, but we have Eleanor of Aquitaine, and we have a drawing of a noblewoman. This is the headgear point. That see how their hair is pretty much just covered. It wraps around the chin. The woman in the drawing has a barbette with a chin strap, while Eleanor, it's just a wimple that goes from the head, covers her chin, covers the entire neckline region. It doesn't really have a shape to the neckline most of the time. If it did, it'd be shallow. What I was building up to with talking about photos is, now here's some photos from Braveheart, which I know, it's not praised for its historical accuracy, even with the costumes. Like, the material that her costumes are made out of didn't exist in this time period. I got it purely because I thought it was a clear photo of what the headgear generally looked like. That part was accurate. Just to get the outline right, that it illustrates that women generally wore headgear with this wimple or barbette that covered most of the hair. There's a chin strap. There really isn't a distinctive neckline because they just wore material that went from the head over the collar region down to the main tunic. So it's really not that big of a neckline there. And also notice that at least they got the general outline right here, that her waistline is low and natural following the hips. So you see this demonstration of my methodology here, talking about High Middle Ages. None of this applies to Rhaenyra and Alicent, but I looked at High Middle Ages and I broke it down into three simple factors: headgear, neckline, waistline. I'm going to continue to do this for late Middle Ages and the Tudor era. As a side note, before I move on, there were two other factors that I wanted to include, but ultimately decided not to because they're a little complicated. These two other factors were sleeves and lacing. I didn't include them because it's a little confusing. It varied considerably from one region to the next, and it doesn't really line up that much with the three eras I'm talking about here. The short explanation is that generally in all three time periods, rich women tended to wear larger sleeves to show off, look how much material I have. And they even have them open cuffed, peeled back, that you're showing off. Not only can I afford a gown made of fine silk or linen, I can afford multiple layers of this expensive material. Basically putting a hat on a hat. And this wasn't quite unique to one specific time period. I will say, getting ahead of myself, it was very common in the Tudor era. and it wasn't quite as common in the late Middle Ages, but I'll get back to this. But I didn't include it in the official chart because it's complicated. I didn't want 5 factors. I wanted something you could remember more easily by shaving that down to just 3 factors. Keep in mind, but the Tudor era is the era of the huge sleeves. You would see bigger sleeves to an extent in the High Middle Ages just because they were open and flowing, and just to be comfortable they were open. But they weren't quite as embellished. You don't need to remember that sleeves detail. That's going to be in the more in-depth follow-up video to this one, after we actually see what the heck Alicent's sleeves look like. The other reason I didn't include this is I can't see Alicent's sleeves. Is she wearing Tudor sleeves that are really open, or are they narrower? We'll have to see. Also, talking about sleeves to show the layers underneath, that they're ruffled and you can see the layers under it, that brings up the question of what those layers were. What layers did women wear? I'll give you a very basic overview, because this will come up again discussing the next 2 big time periods. They'll specifically talk about this, so I have to introduce it. I'm not sure if it was the same in the High Middle Ages, not that it matters too much, because the outermost layer generally covered everything, all the small clothes underneath. But in both the late Middle Ages and the Tudor era, there were basically 3 layers to a noblewoman's clothing. Starting at the skin, you had a shift, then a kirtle, and then the gown. The shift was underclothes, worn directly against the skin. You're not supposed to be able to see a woman's shift in public. Shift is alternatively called a smock or a chemise. The kirtle went over that, and you could see a woman just wearing a kirtle on a day-to-day basis, particularly working class women. But it's not underclothes like the shift is. Yet the real hero of the story is the outermost layer. The big, expensive gown worn over the kirtle. Sometimes the gown doesn't totally enclose the kirtle, but it's almost a jacket over it. Other times the gown does totally lace over the kirtle, but you're supposed to see a little bit of the kirtle at the edges of the gown, peeking out at the cuffs and at the neckline. Or they'd put vents in the arms to show off the material of the kirtle underneath. Again, the point of this is to show off how wealthy you are. Oh, look, not only am I wearing an expensive silk gown, I'm wearing a silk kirtle underneath it. It's showing off. Moving on now from the High Middle Ages and all these side details, next big section here, the second big time period, late Middle Ages. Pay attention here, because we start recognizing some of these features in the House of the Dragon costumes. I'll explain that at the end. This period, the late Middle Ages, lasted from around 1350 with the Black Death until around 1500 when the Reformation started. It's fuzzy at the ends, but basically that's it. So this is the way that people dressed during the 100 Years' War between England and France, and in the ensuing War of the Roses. The Civil War in England fought on and off between 1455 and 1485. George R.R. Martin said that his Westeros novels are loosely inspired by the War of the Roses, and that was between the Yorks and Lancasters. Westeros is a conflict between the Starks and Lannisters, etc. But so when people go, oh, it doesn't really need a time period, it's a fantasy world. Technically, yes, but it's supposed to loosely be like England during the War of the Roses in terms of technology level and what people are wearing and just the society. Obviously, there's some variation, but it's supposed to be the world of the 100 Years' War, War of the Roses, the world of Shakespeare plays, and it's Martin riffing on that. Other features of this era, despite the Black Death and all the endemic warfare that marked the late Middle Ages, this was actually a time of rising wealth, because so many people died. For the first time, there was a lot of money to go around, that there was a labor shortage for the first time ever. And because of that, trade unions could form to negotiate their labor for better wages, in turn leading to the rise of powerful merchant guilds, and from those merchant guilds, eventually banking. So indirectly, and I've had classes on this, indirectly the Black Death led to merchant guilds and banking, and indirectly led to the rise of capitalism from all the other trade guilds and stuff, because so many people died, labor shortage, they could negotiate for things. When I say rising wealth, I mean, for the first time, not just among the nobility, but there were what we would call a rising middle class, a proto-middle class, these wealthy merchants, just people in the cities who weren't technically nobles, and this influenced the fashions of the nobles and so forth. Point is, this was a period of rising wealth. So among the people who were alive, fashions got very ostentatious. One might even say gaudy. So it's extravagant. So the three factors, again, are headgear, neckline, waistline. Headgear in the late Middle Ages, this is the age of huge, ostentatious hats. The specific kind is called a hennin, a big cone with veils trailing off it, reaching to at least the shoulders, and sometimes even to the ground. Again, it's showing off that you can afford, that this is such a huge hat made out of so much silk or linen and wool, a huge hat made out of a lot of material, and there's even rich streamers of silk coming off of it. It's showing it off. A lot of expensive material. Apart from the cone-shaped hennin, there was a major subtype of hennin called an escoffion, which is essentially a double hennin. It was a thick, circular roll of material, could be wool, linen, silk. Sometimes it was vaguely crown-shaped and circular, but often it would be shaped into two forward-facing horns. So while a regular hennin was one big horn, the escoffion was two horns, and facing forward instead of upwards and backwards. I'll show a few examples of this in the next slides. When you see a TV show where characters go to a medieval fair or something, they often put people in a stereotype of cosplayers wearing these big elaborate cones with veils coming off of that. That was actually unique to the late Middle Ages. You know, whenever you see someone, oh, I'm at the Renaissance fair, look at my gigantic hennin hat. If you see someone going, I'm in the First Crusade era, and look at this big hennin hat I'm wearing, that came like 200 years later. That's not the same time period. That this is the stereotype of what people think of when they think medieval fashion. Possibly because Shakespeare's plays about this time period were so popular. I mean, all of his plays about the War of the Roses, this is what people dressed like in the late Middle Ages. Earlier it was different. Tudor era was different because that isn't even medieval anymore. But this is a very unique feature to this time period, this specific period. So whenever you see these big hats, the hennin and the escoffion, this is a big signal. This is a very clear sign, even at a glance, that a costume is specifically from the late Middle Ages. That's headgear. Neckline frequently had a distinctive V shape, cut to show off the material of the kirtle under the gown. Not to show off cleavage or anything. This is what I was going over before this. I had to set it up. It's not revealing the skin underneath. It's revealing the layers of other clothing underneath the gown itself. It's not revealing skin. It's showing off that you're wealthy enough to have two layers of expensive material, both the outer gown and the kirtle. Now, the kirtle itself has a squared neckline. The gown above it has a V-shaped neckline. So what happens is, at the middle of the neckline, you see this wedge-shaped triangle of a bit of the kirtle underneath. And this is very distinctive. This was very popular in the late Middle Ages. And, you know, unlike the high Middle Ages, it actually has a neckline now. Sometimes it would show bare skin. But notice how in the high Middle Ages it was, well, we wore a wimple or a scarf that covered the gap between the headgear and the head and the neck and everything. Now there is clearly a distinction. The neck is bare, nothing below the collarbone like that, but you have this V-shaped cut to the gown, and this triangle-shaped part of the kirtle is showing there. This is very distinctive. Waistline. Unlike the low waistline of prior centuries, the late Middle Ages switched to a high waistline instead of following the natural waistline of the hips. It's now high up, right below the bust line. Now, I haven't worn gowns myself, so tell me in the comments if you have worn high and low-waisted dresses, and please, in the comments, compare the range of movement you have in them when it's a high waistline versus a low waistline. So, I had to read up about this, but the idea is that a gown with a high waistline doesn't follow the body's natural movements, so it's actually a lot more difficult to move around in. Why would you move the waistline up to make it intentionally impractical like this? Well, it's yet another feature meant to show off how wealthy you are. Wearing something that's intentionally difficult to move in announces to the world, I'm so wealthy, I don't need to do physical labor. It's actually a lot like the principle behind clothing in Slaver's Bay in the A Song of Ice and Fire novels. They didn't really do this in the show, they really shorted that whole storyline. But in the books, this is actually pretty prominent. I mean, anyone who read the books will remember this, they talk about it all the time, that a traditional and widespread piece of clothing for men and women in Slaver's Bay is this toga-like outfit called a tokar. It's a long fabric delicately wrapped around the body in such a way that it's intentionally difficult to move quickly in it. You can't really do physical labor in it. And to keep it from falling apart, you have to constantly use one hand to hold it in place. That after Daenerys takes over Meereen, she switches to wearing tokar, so the books describe them pretty frequently. That it falls apart if you don't hold it in place, you can't move very fast in it. They made it this way on purpose to show off, we are the slave masters. The aristocracy of those cities, we are slave masters. It says in the books, this is the type of clothing a slave master would make to show, I don't need to do physical labor. Same principle behind the tokar is at work here in the high waistline of the late Middle Ages. It's intentionally impractical, in order to show off your wealth and status. Before I move on from this time period, though, a quick note on that, as I said before, as time moves forward, you will start to see increasing variation across Europe. So by this middle of the three eras we're looking at, you're going to start seeing some variation from one region to the next, if only due to the simple matter of climate. That I did say the late Middle Ages are the age of huge and ostentatious hats, which is a quick way to recognize a costume from this time period, but while that's generally true, they didn't tend to wear very large hats in the warmer countries of Southern Europe, like Italy or Spain, the increasing wealth of the Italian city-states. They didn't really wear big hats in Italy, like Hennons and Escoffions. It was hot. This whole thing of wearing Hennons and Escoffions, you'd see that across France, England, Germany, maybe as far east as Hungary and Poland. I'm not as familiar with their fashions, but if only because of the weather, you wouldn't wear this in warmer Mediterranean lands. It was impractical. Instead, you were very less likely, in general, to see women completely cover their hair in Mediterranean countries. I'm thinking like Sicily, or even Florence or something. Instead, they'd elaborately braid their hair to keep it up off the body so they wouldn't be hot. I'm a guy, again, I don't think about this that much, but when that women have a built-in hat when they wear long hair that keeps you warm in the winter, but when it's hot in the summer, women braid their hair up more so it doesn't keep your neck as hot. So they'd braid their hair more, keep it off the neck. They'd use a lot of hair nets, also called a crespine. Or they'd coil their braided hair in a hairnet. But that's not even limited to the late Middle Ages, you understand, that this was more common across all time periods for warm weather countries. Like if you're in Spain, Portugal, if you're in the Italian city-states, you would see more braided hair like that in Venice or something, or Florence. So there actually were starting to be a few different fashions across Europe in the late Middle Ages. Climate's the big one I want you to just keep in the back of your mind. By the way, I don't want to burden you with remembering this. I'm trying to keep this relatively short so you'll actually internalize it. This specific design that I said was the design of the late Middle Ages across France and England, this design with the large hennin hats, V-shaped neckline, and high waistline, this is one specific design, though it was the most popular one. This specific design is called a Burgundian gown, because it was popular with the Counts of Burgundy, who grew very powerful in this time. I don't want you to remember this if you don't need to, but long story short, the Counts of Burgundy acquired Flanders and the modern-day Netherlands. They acquired the Low Countries. Burgundy's in eastern France. They acquired the Low Countries, which were the heart of the textile industry. And on top of that, they had also grown so powerful during the 100 Years' War. Burgundy, the Counts of Burgundy, were the parts of France that sided with England in their attempt to conquer the rest of France. This is a whole politics thing. I'm not going to get into it. So the Counts of Burgundy were very powerful and dominated the textile industry. So Burgundian fashions were the ones that were most popular and most widely copied because they were so powerful. You don't need to know all of that. I'm just presenting, when I say this is classic late Middle Ages fashion with the big hat and everything, this was popular across much of France and England. Even people not on the side of the Burgundians would adopt this. It was just really popular. But it originated in Burgundy, so they call it Burgundian fashion. You don't need to remember that. For the rest of this, I'm just going to call it late Middle Ages fashion in Northern Europe. And remember, women in like Italian city-states or Spain were less likely to wear a big hat just because it was hot. Moving on now to the last of the three big time periods we're going to look at. The Tudor era, lasting from around 1500 to around 1600. Many of the excesses of the late Middle Ages style were dialed back now. The way this happened is that the church finally stepped in to oppose it. They said, you're all walking around showing off how wealthy you are. This is ungodly, your vanity. So the church finally stepped in to dial back all these ostentatious clothes that, like, people are starving and you're dressing so ornately. So they passed various sumptuary laws to restrict all these huge, gaudy designs. So the huge ostentatious hats are gone suddenly, and the waistline returned back to a low natural position at the hips. No more of that flaunting, I have a high waistline because I don't need to do physical work stuff. At the same time, Europe had gone through the Renaissance. It started in the south and moved to the north. The Renaissance had happened. The continent was entering into an unprecedented era of prosperity. So the actual quality and refinement of the materials is a lot better. Just passage of time, rising wealth, everything is increasingly better made. It's not like homespun wool anymore. So it's better quality cloth and designs. They're just a little more subtle about it than the huge, gaudy things in the late Middle Ages. Oh, I skipped out of order a little just because the waistline thing is short. That the church said, stop wearing high waistlines to show off how wealthy you are, so the waistlines are low and natural again. But I went out of order. I usually start with headgear. That's the waistline stuff. Now I'll explain the headgear in detail. It's important, because this will come up for House of the Dragon. Because there was that backlash against the gigantic hennin hats, they shifted to having very small hats. One of the most common of these was called a French hood. It's actually a small, thin headdress worn over a cap, circular, with a veil at the rear to cover the hair going down the back. So it's not like at the end of the late Middle Ages, when they said you can't keep wearing these big hats, they said, okay, we'll switch back to the cloth wimples that cover the entire head. They didn't switch back. They just said, okay, then we'll have really tiny hats. So this is distinct from either of the previous two eras. You can see a lot of the hair is actually exposed by the French hood, like the entire front half of the head. You can see the hair. It's not scandalous to see a woman's hair now. The entire front of the hair parted in the middle. There was actually some regional variation, though, with this, as there was a kind of headgear unique to England called a gable hood. And because it was only from England, it was also just called an English hood. The gable hood had a pointed shape like the gable of a house, and was overall a bit more concealing. It would actually cover all the hair, while the French hood revealed the front half. Gable hoods were not popular for very long, just a few decades at the beginning of this era, like the last decade or two of the 1400s, maybe the first decade of the 1500s, and only in England. Then after that, England adopted the French hood. So it's a very specific time period when this English gable hood was briefly on the stage. But after they switched to the French hood, it remained the standard headgear throughout the rest of the Tudor era. I need to explain some of the politics of this. Much of fashion was shaped by monarchs and their political alliances, rising and falling in favor, right? Henry VIII's first wife was Catherine of Aragon, and despite being from Spain, and she introduced some other elements of Spanish dress there, she adopted the English gable hood. When you see paintings of Catherine of Aragon, she wanted to go, no, I'm English now, so I'm wearing your English hood. However, Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn, popularized the French hood in England, that when Anne Boleyn came in, suddenly the gable hood became out of favor because it was associated with Catherine, and everyone switched to the French hood to emulate Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was born in England, but her father was a diplomat, so Anne spent most of her youth at the royal court in France. So Anne brought in all these French fashion things like the French hood. Towards the end, not to get too down in the weeds, towards the end, near the reign of Queen Elizabeth, from 1558 to 1603, that's when she reigned, very near the end, closer to the 1590s, they switched to the little hats that you'll see in Shakespeare times, if you've seen period dramas for Shakespeare movies and stuff. But that's after what we really consider the Tudor era. That's the Elizabethan Shakespearean era. Well, Elizabeth ruled a long time. Shakespeare wrote his plays from about 1590 to 1610. Elizabeth started her reign in 1558, so she started reigning like 30 years before that. So the very tail end of the Tudor era, because Elizabeth ruled a long time, like closer to the 1590s, 1600, you might start seeing those little hats at the very end of this. But that's not really considered Tudor. That when people think of a Tudor hat, like maybe the first decade was the English hood, and maybe the last decade it was starting to see foreshadowing of the Elizabethan era, because these are the hats they wore. But for a good 80 years or so, when people thought of a Tudor hat, they thought of the French hood. It's very important. Last factor on this checklist is neckline. The Tudor era had a very distinctive, instantly recognizable shape. The gown's neckline is square cut and very wide, reaching out almost to the edge of the shoulders. Sometimes there would be a transparent veil covering from the top of the gown up to the neck itself to cover everything, but frequently it would be bare skin. The backlash against ostentatious stuff from the late Middle Ages, it affected headgear and waistline more, but they still used the neckline to show off multiple layers. It was just cut in a different shape. While the late Middle Ages, they'd have this broad V shape dipping down to show a triangle wedge of the square-cut kirtle underneath. Now, both the kirtle and the gown had a square cut to them. So you see the kirtle is now parallel to the gown. So in some cases, like the top inch or so of the kirtle would extend up above the top of the gown. It would be richly embroidered and just showing off, look, I can afford to have another layer underneath. But they're both square to each other. In summary, I put all this info together in a single, easy-to-read chart. 3 factors across 3 different broad time periods. Trying to keep this relatively simple introductory level. The fewer factors I have, the more likely you're to remember it. And instead of going by time period now, I'm going by the feature. Headgear. In the High Middle Ages, it was a barbet with a chin strap or a wimple, usually covering the neck as well. Then in the Late Middle Ages, you had huge and ostentatious hats, cone-shaped hennons or double hennons like horns called escoffions. Then by the Tudor era, there was a pushback against that excess, so they switched to smaller hats such as the French hood, which is sort of a rounded fan in the back showing off the front half of the hair. Neckline across the time periods. In the High Middle Ages, it started out pretty simple. I mean, it was shallow and rounded. It was usually covered anyway by the wimple or a wrapped veil. But then in the Late Middle Ages, this switched to a distinctive V-shape to the gown, showing off the second layer of material on the square-cut kirtle underneath. And then finally, in the Tudor era, they switched to this very distinctive square cut to the gown, wide all the way to the shoulders. And waistline. Started out low in the High Middle Ages, low along the natural placement of the hips, but then in the Late Middle Ages they switched to a high waistline just below the bust, intentionally impractical to show off that you're so wealthy you don't need to do physical work. But then by the Tudor era there was pushback against this by the church, like they were also pushing back against the ostentatious hats. Sumptuary laws and stuff reined that in. So they then, by the Tudor era, switched back to a low and natural waistline. Before I move on to House of the Dragon, which will go faster because I covered all this stuff already, all the context for it, there's a few other details that I want to go over briefly. I don't need you to remember this because I want to limit it to the 3 main factors. Sleeves, as I mentioned before, they show off a lot of layers of material using larger sleeves, and this was very prominent in the Tudor era. That's a whole separate issue. And also, Tudor dress usually laced up the sides under the arms. That, like, one of my Twitter followers, Heather Hewson, was one of the people who pointed out to me, no, this isn't exactly like what Anne Boleyn wore. And another one was one of my Twitter followers, Xenon Faye. And she knows a lot more about these period costumes than I do, and she's been sending me a lot of information. So this would be so much to cover. I'm going to do more of it in subsequent videos when we have more of screenshots to go on, because we don't even know what Alicent's sleeves look like. Rather than go into a lot of detail, I'm just going to read off as a direct quote, as a slide, what she summarized to me about sleeves and lacing. So this is Xenon Faye, quote, and she's been of great help. Quote, in the beginning of the 1500s, sleeves are following the later 1400s trend, seen on the Burgundian gown, of being generally small and close to the skin. By the 1530s, you can see that the main sleeve design changes dramatically and now are wide and open, and they also frequently feature false foresleeves that are tied on separately. The lacing placement was also a class issue, as working classes more frequently have center lacing for easy access, while back lacing is more frequently seen in upper class dress. So the Tudor look was really perfected by the 1530s after Anne Boleyn brought in the French hood and all these other things like the sleeves came in. But think about that, again, because I'm a guy, I don't wear gowns. Like, tell me in the comments if you're a girl on here, if you had to, wear a fancy prom dress, why do those lace up the back and not up the front like you're, just work over a work outfit or something? It's not a work jacket. It's supposed you wear a fancy dress to a wedding or something that laces up the back because it's part of it is I could not physically put this on properly by myself. I need to have a servant lace me into it from behind. It's just the little things of Why is it considered impressive to have a high-waisted gown? It shows you don't work. Why have lacing or zipping up the back? To show I can afford to have someone waiting on me like this. And it's an imitation. Obviously, it's like for the prom or something, your mom or a sister or a friend would help you do it. But it's that imitation of, oh, look, this is something so ornate I couldn't put it on as one person, which is fascinating. You don't think about it, but yeah. Also, beginning in this time period, the Tudor era, they started adding structure to a woman's skirt with this thing called a farthingale, which is a sort of hoop skirt using rings underneath, like wood rings, bone, other stuff, hard material. They start making these hoop skirts called a farthingale that made the outline of the skirt more conical compared to earlier periods, which were relatively form-fitting. Game of Thrones used a mix of those. Like there's points where Cersei's wearing something that's so conical she must be wearing a farthingale or something like it underneath, but that's just because they mixed and matched stuff then. Also, in the Tudor era, and this is important, the bodice was more structured and rounded out by adding this thing called a busk in the front. Underneath the gown, this is underclothes. It was basically a large flat board of wood or bone or ivory used to make the torso more perfectly rounded. But it isn't form-fitting, it's like a round tube around the torso, and the busk is what enables that. Speaking of which, this branches off into another topic, and I'm going to run through this as quickly as I can. Undergarments. Specifically, what goes into the category of foundation garments for women. I didn't know all this, I had to look it up, but they didn't have brassieres. They didn't have bras in any of these eras. Not the specific type of foundation garment called a bra, which was developed only in the early decades of the 20th century. That specific design. We don't know much about the history of undergarments because logically they don't appear in paintings, and people didn't write about them a lot in the very early Middle Ages. But if you think about it, the type of foundation you wore underneath affected the overall outline of the clothes over it. In fact, that's the whole point of something like a bra or a corset. It's to alter the outline of your clothes, of your body like that. So, what's the history of these foundation garments across these time periods? Well, for the High Middle Ages or earlier, we don't really know. There's not much evidence. It's possible they just didn't have them at all. There might have been some early corsets in the late Middle Ages, but it wasn't a general feature. Then, in the 1500s, the Tudor era, they had the combination of not just a corset, as we would call it, but the corset was strapping on this big flat board called a busk in the front to make the middle of the gown this rounded cone. While the idea was that the middle was supposed to be rounded, but it would push your breasts up at the neckline, so your breasts look really firm at the top, at the neckline. They look big that way, but it isn't this natural curves. I mean, the middle of the torso looks like a tube. It wasn't trying to enhance the natural curvature of the body. After this time period, after the time period we're looking at, I mean, we're talking 1600s to 1700s. By the 1600s, the busk fell out of fashion, so they were no longer trying to be a rounded cone. But like 1650-ish, think around then, regular corsets became very common, now enhancing the natural curvature. But that's early modern era. That's long after the medieval time periods we're looking at. As I said, I know little and less about historical foundation garments across a scale of centuries. I don't know recreation costuming to actually wear. That they're costume enthusiasts who actually, I want to have completely accurate down to the skin. This is every layer. I'm not just wearing like a modern bra underneath. No, I'll wear what they wore. It affects the shape of it. It has to be accurate. So for women's foundation garments in this historical era, I asked Costume Co. who, like I said earlier, runs her own TV and movies costume analysis channel, has made several very good Game of Thrones costume analysis videos. In fact, her channel just reached its 5-year anniversary, so congratulations. What she pointed out to me is that what little we saw of women's foundation garments in Game of Thrones was actually from anachronistic time periods. There's really only one scene in the whole show where we see the layers of what were women wearing underneath. This does affect the overall outline. One scene in Season 3, Episode 6, when Sansa is being dressed by Shay before Tyrion comes in to talk. There's this one time where we actually got a very clear shot of her taking off the outer layer to see what's on underneath that, to see the different layers of what do noble women wear in this Westeros show. And when we did, she's wearing a corset. And we have one or two less clear shots of this in other episodes. We have when Sansa is attacked by rioters in Season 2, they tear her gown enough that we can see the same corset underneath. And there's like one other shot of Cersei in her bedroom with her gown worn loose. I forget what episode that was, but she wears her gown loose in her bedroom once. You can see she's wearing a corset like Sansa is. But those aren't really much for King's Landing fashion. The big one, really the only one, is this one episode where Sansa took her gown off when she was dressing, and you're wearing a relatively modern-looking corset. This isn't medieval. Well, modern. It isn't from the 20th, 21st century or anything. But Costume Co., she pointed out to me, this is a relatively advanced-looking corset. Not even from, like, the 1600s. Costume Co. said, no, this is like a relatively developed corset from the 1700s. In terms of its design and how detailed it is. Like I said before, the A Song of Ice and Fire novels, it's a fantasy. Well, it's supposed to be this loose analog of the War of the Roses, which was late Middle Ages, when they didn't really have corsets in the late Middle Ages. Curious about this, I did a quick search of the novels using an e-search tool, plugging in various keywords. Words like corset, kirtle, busk, all those. And doing a keyword search, the word corset never appears in any of the books. Nor does busk, that Tudor thing. But words like gown, kirtle, and shift do appear to describe clothing. I had to check the variants of shift, like cotardi and smock, that the only thing they call the undergarments that are right next to the skin, the innermost layer, is a shift. So they use those three terms in the books, not a lot. I mean, rarely. Martin doesn't really describe clothing in much detail. But the words gown, kirtle, and shift, that three-part pairing, they appear in that. Corset never does. I mean, Martin isn't a historical costume recreationist, so he doesn't really go into it that much, but when women are described as putting on clothing layers or stuff, that's what they say, like when women are going to bed, or when they mention at Chataya's brothel, there was a prostitute wearing only a shift on a man's lap, that sort of thing. So there really is no mention of what we would call foundation garments at all. They don't have bras, obviously. They don't have corsets from the 1700s. That's a later thing. The TV show put that in. I'm not sure why. There's a bunch of questions. There's like 24 different questions I'd ask Michelle Clapton, and this is not near the top of the list. Top of my list would be things like, what were your design ideas behind how people dress in the Vale or the Stormlands? Because she's never really talked about that much. But, wow, why do women dress this way? It's not modern, it's not medieval, it's kind of early modern. Because it does affect the overall shape and outline of their clothing. Now, I went into this in detail because all this stuff about a Tudor busk is going to come up again when I discuss Alicent. This concludes my comparatively brief and simple summary of a couple of centuries of real-life medieval fashions. across these three eras. Relatively short. Entire books are on each of these time periods. An hour or two is relatively short here. That's all the background on the three eras. Now, let's turn to the promo pics from House of the Dragon. One quick overview thing about them before I get into individual characters. For both Rhaenyra and Alicent, earrings. I've mentioned this before in greater detail in the first reaction videos I made to these promo pics. I checked, no one in the Game of Thrones TV series ever wore earrings. At all. Not Cersei, not Marjorie, not Sansa, nothing. I checked through everything. Alicent and Rhaenyra, however, do have earrings in these promo shots. And I did a quick e-search tool of the novels for various keywords. It turns out that noble women in Westeros actually do wear earrings, but it's only mentioned a handful of times. You would really have to hunt for this. It's easy to miss. There's one quote from when Sansa is at her wedding to Tyrion, her forced wedding to Tyrion. It says of Sansa that moonstones hung from her ears and about her neck. So apparently earrings aren't unusual in Westeros. It's a noblewoman in King's Landing would be seen wearing these. It's not something exotic from the Free Cities or something. So noblewomen in King's Landing would have earrings. It's just that for whatever reason, Martin barely points it out. It's there in the background, unstated. He gives a lot of description about food at feasts and banquets, but not as much about... it's part of a trend. He doesn't really describe the clothing that much in terms of the specific cut. He'll say Cersei had this elegant Myrish lace, but it's text, it's not visual. He doesn't go into that much detail about what the costumes look like. There's a bit of detail on costuming, but he doesn't really describe the jewelry as much. I can see how people miss this. It's a little odd. So I don't know. The books really only mention it once, but in such a way that it seems like it's an everyday thing they just go unremarked on. I really wish this is one of the things I'd ask Clapton about. Why does no one wear earrings? Was this a conscious decision? Because women in the late Middle Ages and the Tudor era, particularly the Tudor era, they wore earrings. Look at Natalie Dormer's The Tudors show, had a lot of earrings in it. And it's weird when you contrast the photos of Natalie Dormer with earrings as Anne Boleyn versus Marjorie Tyrell, and it's, why was this change there? I know it's not that big of a thing to obsess over. It's the fact that I have no idea why this happened, more than whether it's a big detail, and it just seems so banal, but it's strange. So one of the things I'd ask Clapton or Tamim if she's doing a Q&A for the new TV series, why does everyone have earrings now? They used to not, and why didn't they? Did they ever tell you why? Was this a planned decision? It's strange, because I'm a guy, I don't think about that, but female fans are always pointing out, there weren't earrings in it. When I draw fan art of this, I put earrings on them. Very strange. At any rate, like I said, late Middle Ages, Tudor, you'd start seeing more earrings. Wasn't really as common in the High Middle Ages, the first era, because, they had the wimple or the barbet on that concealed their hair, usually concealed their ears as well, so why would you put earrings on there? Eras before that, like Roman times, had earrings and stuff, so wouldn't be out of place to see that by, the 1400s. So I don't know why Game of Thrones took that out, but it's not that they're inventing something by putting this in, that people have earrings in the books. It's strange that they didn't in the show. So we'll ask about that later. I'm not sure how this came about, but it sort of does add to the growing list of things that make House of the Dragon look different for a later time period, that women have earrings, that they seem to have a lot more jewelry in general, both on their hands and necklaces and stuff. They had necklaces in Game of Thrones, but they weren't nearly as prominent as this. With the decorations that Alicent has on her costume, that's another late medieval thing, which we didn't see that much of in Game of Thrones, barring the late Queen Cersei dress from like season 7, but it is a way that this show looks stylistically different from the Game of Thrones era. Moving on from that overview, now we get to the core of it. Analyzing the first ever promo photo of Alicent Hightower in costume. Like I said, we only have a head profile shot, so this is very preliminary. I mean, of the 3 factors I talk about, we can't see the waistline, so who knows? We can't see her sleeves or her skirt, so we can't analyze that either. So let's focus on scrutinizing what we can. What can we see? The neckline and headgear. Like I said, at first I thought, oh, she's dressed exactly like Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, in Tudor-era costume, but then other fans pointed out to me that, no, there are several key differences. Well, the first thing that stands out is a Tudor feature. That right away, looking at it, what jumps out at you is that, yes, Alicent has a very distinctive Tudor-style neckline. Square cut and wide to the shoulders. This is why I initially mistook it for the general outline of what Anne Boleyn wore. However, focusing on her headgear, this is not a French hood, like what Anne Boleyn wore. And, other people, Heather, Xenon, Faye, they point out to me, this isn't a French hood. And I realized, you're right, it couldn't be. It's too big. The French hood is thin. This is a thick, heavy, padded, curved roll, decorated with a lot of gold. And I realized this is probably an escoffion hat. Not from the Tudor era, but from the late Middle Ages. Granted, it's a relatively small escoffion compared to some other designs. It doesn't have the shaped double horns, but it's still this heavy, round, padded. A lot of us are saying this is some kind of escoffion. What really convinced me this is some kind of escoffion is that when we were going through the spy photos, all the spy photos from the Cornwall shoot for other characters back in May, for the Driftmark scenes, for the funeral scene, a lot of women coming to that who aren't the main cast, but background women at that, coming to Driftmark. Multiple women are wearing much larger hats than Alicent has, which are very clearly escoffions. I mean, side by side, these directly look like sketches of escoffions in fashion guidebooks I've seen. Some of them even have the characteristic double horns. Not all of them. Some are fan-shaped, circular. Some are the classic double horns. What these women are wearing is clearly an escoffion, but there's more than one kind of escoffion. There's a double-horned one, then there's more rounded ones, which, well, is that a different kind of rounded hat? We're debating this a little, but I'm pretty sure they're... Because the Driftmark people are wearing escoffions, this is probably the era Alicent is drawing from. And because it's rounded, it almost looks like a French hood at certain angles, or if you're looking at it far away, but zoomed in. This thing is way too thick. It's this padded roll to be the flat, thin French hood. It just doesn't look like that. So, given that we clearly see women in spy photos wearing the escoffions, that's what I think this is. The point of all of this, in summary of the 2 factors we can tell about Alicent's costume, is that it's not Tudor era, it's mix and matching from 2 different eras. I'm not sure if this is some combination that ever existed in real life. She's got a square-cut Tudor neckline from the 1500s with a late Middle Ages, late 1400s padded escoffion hat. Now, granted, these 2 eras are right next to each other. I mean, we're talking, like the end of the Wars of the Roses, 1485-ish. That's when the late Middle Ages ended, but it's not like it was just someone flipped a switch. So this is like fashion during the reign of Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, after he defeated Richard III, like really 1480s, 1490s, and I don't know as much about costuming by specific decade. But is this some transitional overlap of features that could have existed in real life when people were slowly adopting features of the new designs, or did it all come at once, paired with each other? I'm not really sure. And the reason I was hemming and hawing about this is there has been some debate in the online community with Costume Co. with her costume channel, she did this great analysis video for Alicent, and she felt that this wasn't an Escoffian. She said she thinks they're trying to depict something from Italy during this time period called a balzo headdress, which it's sort of like a turban that shows your hair in the front. So in loose outline, it can look sort of like this. It looks like a really big Escoffian, but it's a little different. It's a little rounded. It's more of a turban than padded material. The balzo headdress was popular in Italy during the 1530s. So this isn't late medieval, it's Reformation. This is, you remember the whole, I was getting down in the weeds of, I'm calling this Tudor, but not every country had a Tudor era, maybe Reformation. This was contemporary with Anne Boleyn in the 1530s. People from Italy, if you were on the Tudor show with Anne Boleyn and Natalie Dormer, if a merchant woman came from Italy, she'd be wearing a balzo headdress, basically. However, I don't think it's a balzo headdress, respectfully, because those tended to be really big. And I'm not an expert, this is just from Googling around. The really classic ones, when you look it up, are really huge. I mean, it's an outright turban. And they often didn't have veils in the back. This does have a veil in the back. Escoffians had veils on the back to cover your hair. So it's not a classic balzo headdress. It might be a really small one. We're debating whether this is a small balzo headdress or an unusually large escoffion. And is there overlap in the middle? We'd have to ask. I don't think it's meant to be a turban because it's not as spherical. And the thing that tipped the balance for me was that the other women we saw in the Driftmark set were clearly wearing double-horned escoffions. That I don't think that Tamim was drawing from Italy for this, because like Old Town is warm and temperate. It's the southernmost part of Westeros on the west coast. I think this is just an unusually large escoffion. As Costume Co. pointed out, escoffions aren't supposed to be this garishly large. So it's hard to say exactly what they're going for with this. So on our checklist of things to look for is other costumes we see Alicent wearing in different shots, in promo pics and in teaser trailers. What do her other hats look like? Is this closer to late medieval England or Reformation era Italy? But it isn't just straight up England in the Tudor era, regardless of any of that. It's Costume Co. thinks it's a mix and match purely from the Reformation era of an English gown with an Italian headdress. I'm leaning towards that it's a mix of late medieval England era hat with Tudor era England gown. But it isn't just a direct copying from one thing that existed historically. This is a mix-mash of a couple of features. And we'll know more when we see more photos exactly what they're going for. And again, this is in contrast with how Clapton, to her credit, she did this on purpose. She said, I'm making up original designs because it's not our world, and I don't want it to just look derivative. So Clapton's stuff wasn't a mix-mash from different eras. It was original stuff, like the Lannister stuff or the Tyrell stuff. This is drawing from historical eras. It's mix and matching different ones. One other thing, which it's a little off the edge of the photo, but if you look closely, interesting thing I think we can glean from this when I was doing my research on this, if you zoom in, look at the bodice. I know it's cut off, it's on the bottom. I don't think this is a Tudor era bodice, where I spent so much time explaining they had a busk, which was like this corset that had a hard board of material like wood or paneling under, or ivory or something, to give your torso this round tube shape. Look at this in side-by-side comparison photos. Alicent's gown doesn't look like a flat, rounded tube. It follows the contours of her bust line. That this isn't what Anne Boleyn wore. So we're waiting on a better photo of this, of the full costume. it really seems that there are actually two major differences that we can readily tell between Alicent Hightower and true Tudor fashion. She doesn't have Tudor headgear, one way or another. This is not a French hood. And she doesn't have the iconic flat busk cone to her midsection. Anne Boleyn would not have worn this. And other features we have to look out for when we see the whole thing, or does it have like Tudor-era huge sleeves, or does it have smaller sleeves, which are really more late medieval? Does it have a farthingale hoop skirt, which was much more of a Tudor thing? Be on the lookout for that. And was this something that existed historically in that transitional period in like 1490 when it was really early Tudor? I'm not sure. I'm waiting to ask experts who really know stuff by the decade of what was Henry VII's wife, Elizabeth of York, wearing. I try to look up historical paintings of like, well, who was the queen at the time? Elizabeth of York? She's usually depicted wearing an English gable hood, which Alicent doesn't have. Did they just switch immediately from the big hats to the gable hood? And Elizabeth of York also has a square-cut neckline, but okay, then what was Richard III's wife wearing? Anne Neville, compared to that? It doesn't really give you a good sense of that. Historical costumers for like Shakespearean plays would know more than me. We'll have to see, and this is very limited info for Alicent. Regardless, this is mix and matching elements from like the last decade of the 1400s and the first decades of the 1500s, like right after the Wars of the Roses ended. And the A Song of Ice and Fire series is loosely inspired by the Wars of the Roses, Martin said this. Which leads to another question, new section here. This isn't A Song of Ice and Fire and the War of the Five Kings. This is a separate conflict 2 centuries before that. The Dance of the Dragons is based on an earlier civil war in England called the Anarchy. Whereas the Wars of the Roses were in the late 1400s, the anarchy between Matilda and Stephen lasted almost 20 years, between the 1130s through 1150s. So this is like 300 years before the Wars of the Roses. That was back during the High Middle Ages, as you'll note. Remember, I was going over this is what people wore in the High Middle Ages, even though we don't see them in the promo pics. I included that in part because if you were doing a one-for-one with Matilda and Stephen in the Anarchy, they'd be dressed high medieval. Entirely different. Though even, showrunner Ryan Condal, in his brief comments, did acknowledge that medieval fashion changed very slowly on the scale of centuries, so 200 years isn't actually that long, relatively speaking. It's more that these different individuals with their own fashion styles have different preferences. Nonetheless, we're looking at a difference of like 300 years in setting, but it looks more advanced. That designs during the Anarchy in the 1100s are relatively simple, and that this is 200 years before in Westeros, and you're using costumes that we would consider contemporary with the War of the Five Kings, this pseudo-War of the Roses. So, the question is, why did Jani Tamim choose to give House of the Dragon characters fashion designs that are arguably more advanced than really fit the setting? That we're not seeing Anarchy stuff, we're seeing Tudor stuff, early Tudor stuff. My running guess, and I'd love to ask Tamim about this herself eventually, is that they want to show that the lead up to the Dance of the Dragons was officially when House Targaryen was at its height. The books state that historians generally hold that the reign of Rhaenyra's father, Viserys I, was the height of House Targaryen, that while he succeeded his grandfather, Jaehaerys, he had this 50-year reign of peace, and then he reigned for another 30 years. So between the two of them, this was this unprecedented 80-year-long era of peace and prosperity. Viserys inherited it after a 50-year reign of the other guy. But it wasn't, just for the Targaryens, but by extension for the entire realm, Westeros as a whole. They said within a century after the conquest, the population of Westeros doubled. Imagine that population boom. It outright doubled because the Targaryens put an end to all the internal wars. And there was this long era of peace. Rising prosperity, just on a macro level, scale of centuries, things hadn't been this good in a really long time. And the Targaryens themselves, of course, were never stronger, never had so many dragons before this. There were never this many Targaryens. They said the family was bigger because they hadn't been culled by civil wars yet. But then they got devastated by the Dance of the Dragons, which a civil war they never fully recovered from. So few dragons lived after it, so few survived, they couldn't maintain a stable breeding population, they died out in 20 years. So, Season 1 of House of the Dragon, Reign of Viserys I, this is officially in universe supposed to be the Targaryen Golden Age. Why depict everyone wearing relatively simple fashion styles that look primitive? It's supposed to be this lost golden era. It's this lost golden age compared to Game of Thrones and the War of the Five Kings era, this degenerate time where the Targaryens dwindled and went insane and got overthrown by the Baratheons anyway. So it's this lost golden age where their society reached a peak it never quite matched again. I actually almost think that it wouldn't have been totally out of place if they had everyone wearing like late Elizabethan fashions almost, like Shakespeare fashions, just to show how it's a very different time period, that society was dialed back a couple of notches because of this. No, they shouldn't do that. That's too modern. But to be clear, I wouldn't do that, but I can see the argument that you want to push that fashions at the beginning are very different to show just how much this civil war knocked them down a peg on a societal level. Better example, Lord of the Rings. You know what fashion looks like in Gondor? But they're making a prequel actually showing Numenor, the Atlantis-like original civilization. Gondor was founded by refugees fleeing Numenor's destruction. So there's an argument for the Amazon Lord of the Rings show that if you're actually showing Numenor on screen in that prequel, shouldn't people dress in a way that's more advanced than Gondor? You don't go, oh, well, this is thousands of years ago, so they should dress more primitively in Numenor. No, they had stuff in Numenor and Lost Arts that they never recovered. This is this lost Atlantis where, no, it should be shining crystal spires and togas and stuff. No, it should look really advanced in Numenor. Same thing is at play here, just on a smaller scale of, no, before the Dance of the Dragons, things were very different, and society never quite reached that peak again in Westeros. So I think that's what Tamim is going for here, and it'll be interesting if she's planned out that fashion will change from one season to the next. Clapton did that too, to show political allegiances, have background characters start dressing like Marjorie instead of Cersei to show that she's losing political power. I wonder if Tamim has planned out that, like, by the middle of the war, people won't be dressing the same at the royal courts anymore. That'll be interesting. Years from now, when they get to, like, a Regency sequel show, like the court of Aegon III, what will people dress like to differentiate it from it's not as good as it was during Viserys I's reign? I don't know if opulent is a word I'd use, but refined. Anyway. So that covers Alicent Hightower's design, that she's dressed not exactly like Anne Boleyn, but like an English noblewoman from the very end of the Wars of the Roses, verging on early Tudor era, like some overlap in the 1490-ish region. What about Rhaenyra's design? So moving on to Rhaenyra now. Initially, I had no idea what to make of this. No one did, even the dedicated costuming channel, so we're not really sure what they're going for here. It looks vaguely modernish, we're not really sure what to think of this. But for me, Alicent was the key. Realizing that Jani Tamim is actually basing these designs on real historical fashions, not just her own original fantasy constructs like Clapton did, that instead of like a Star Wars fantasy world, this could be anything, that Unlike Clapton, I'm so used to working with Clapton stuff that I never cross-referenced Clapton with real-life history, that, oh, Tamim is, at least some of this is based on Tudor stuff, and then late medieval. It's actually worth investing time in researching those eras thoroughly, because I haven't throughout the entire run of Game of Thrones. It wasn't actually very relevant to Clapton's stuff. Now it is. Real historical fashion trends. And that's why this took so long, because I'm not an expert on this. I had to look it all up. That's why this stuff came out in May, but I'm doing this now. That I had to, while I was doing other news reporting, slowly research, okay, just online sites and guides, what were the different fashions everywhere. That if Alicent is wearing what an English noblewoman would be wearing, it stands to reason that maybe Rhaenyra, her great rival, is wearing a rival fashion that historically existed contemporary to it from a different part of Europe. Same time period, rival fashion. So I looked around. What were the different fashion zones in Europe around the year 1500-ish, that specific decade range? Well, it varied considerably. I mean, sometimes even between different Italian city-states, there was no unified Italian style necessarily, because they were independent of each other. Sometimes Milan and Florence or Venice could be different. Sometimes they're the same. So recognize this is an oversimplification, and it's actually very diverse. I said it gets more diverse the farther along you go in history, it diverges more. But short version, the general trend for what we think of as Tudor fashion that Alicent is wearing, the Anne Boleyn thing, Tudor fashion didn't actually originate in England or with the Tudors. It actually started in Spain. This was a Spain fashion that spread to the rest of Western Europe. Spain was in a real boom period at this time, motivated by an unprecedented new era of wealth. All these people getting very powerful in Spain, and the aristocracy was, innovating new fashions and showing off their wealth. Talked about all this before, but not just as part of the Europe-wide trend. All of Europe was doing better. Specifically, Spain was head and shoulders above the rest. This unprecedented era of wealth and power for Spain after 1500. Well, where did all this new wealth come from? From conquering the Aztecs and Incas in the Americas. All that plundered New World gold and silver coming in. I mentioned this before in my economics video, that eventually so much looted gold came in so fast to Spain by the end of the 1500s that it actually led to inflation on a national scale. That the point is to acquire more of pre-existing gold that your enemies have. If you just find a gold mine, if you dump gold on the market, it's less valuable. So it led to inflation and stuff, but that's from the other video. But from looting the Aztecs and the Incas and expanding their colonial empire in what became Latin America, Spain was the superpower of the 1500s. Particularly the early 1500s, this is the time period when Spain was the most powerful monarchy in Europe, and all the other alliances had to shift around to try and counterbalance it. I mean, this went through the reign of Henry VIII, through all the way through Elizabeth's time with the Spanish Armada and stuff. So Spain had all this rising wealth and power. They're the superpower of Europe. And there was a burst in new fashions, which then combined with some innovations in fashions from the also powerful Italian city-states like Venice, which Venice and the other Italian city-states in turn prospered from being trade allies with Spain through all the trade networks, these mercantilist city-states. So through a combination, there's whole books on this, how it developed, but basically this new fashion, Reformation fashion, developed in Spain because it was this rising power at the time, overlapping with developments in the Italian city-states, which fashions they sold to Spain and so forth in the mercantilist centers in Italy. But we should really call this Spain style. That everything in this fashion, the elements like square-cut wide necklines and farthingale hoop skirts, and the busk to make it like a tube. That started in Spain. But then it started in Spain, crossed over with Italy a little bit, then it spread to France, and eventually it then in turn spread to England. This is what Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, wore and popularized at the English court. I said you can tie it to specific monarchs and time periods. She's the one that introduced the Spain style there. You know, she adopted the English hood, but otherwise all the other elements of the actual gown were Spain. Then when Anne Boleyn displaced her, the slight difference was Anne brought in the French hood that had been developed in France, but otherwise they were pretty much copying what Spain was already doing. Because like I said, Anne grew up in France, even though she was English. Now, the irony to all this, of course, is that Henry VIII's Tudor England went on to be a big rival of both Spain and France. But his court ended up copying what was fashionable in those foreign courts. Well, it's just the vagaries of history that when at the time, early on, when he married Catherine of Aragon, they were briefly flirting with the idea of an England-Spain alliance, which of course got displaced by his divorce. But even though he divorced her, lost the alliance with Spain, the fashion just stuck, because it's what fashionable people were wearing across all the powerful places in Spain and France. Sometimes if you're powerful enough, even your enemies will copy your fashions. So that they had introduced it when they were briefly allies, and it just stuck around. So this Spain style, what we call Tudor style, that was, again, there's exceptions to this, but for the most part, it was dominant, most popular in Spain, most of the Italian city-states, France, even England. But that isn't how all of Europe dressed during this time period. I'm not even talking about like the Greek lands or the Russian lands. I mean, the northern and eastern parts of Europe didn't copy Spain's fashions like this. Particularly Germany and the Low Countries. I mean, collectively, Germany and the Low Countries are the lands of the Holy Roman Empire. Didn't dress like Spain did. Because these lands of the Holy Roman Empire, northern Germany, the Netherlands, for the most part, as the 1500s played out, they turned into Protestant lands. Politics played a big role in which local rulers decided to actively embrace Protestantism, of course. That's why so much of Northern Europe turned Protestant. They're regions that didn't have deep ties to the papacy down south in Italy at Rome. They weren't physically close geographically allies. They were at the fringes of Europe in the north and went, we don't need to be bossed around by the Pope like this. So eventually to the rival German princedoms, the little Germanys, that Austria in the south was mostly Catholic. It's generally more Protestant as you go north. But it varies from one county to the next because, hey, Cius Regio, Eius Religio. Basically, we're talking about fashions in Protestant countries that didn't want to imitate major Catholic powers like Spain or France. Well, you'll point out, well, then why did Tudor England adopt so many fashions from its rivals like Spain and France? Catholic Spain and Catholic France. Why were they still dressing like Catholics by the time of like Henry's fifth and sixth wife? Well, was Henry VIII really Protestant enough? The Puritans would have something to say about that. But okay, broadly, very broadly, within what we consider Western Europe, by which I mean not Eastern Orthodox, not Greek, not Russian, but Poland west of that, basically there were two big fashions. There was the Spain style, which spread to France, Italy, England, and some of southern Germany, depending on who your allies were. There's a lot of variation there, but there was another big, more or less unified fashion zone stretching from like Amsterdam to Munich, that from the Low Countries to the eastern marches of Germany in the north, things like Pomerania or something. This is how northern Germany dressed particularly. And even a lot of southern Germany too, just because it's you copy your neighbors sometimes. But what are the features of this German Low Country style, this Holy Roman Empire style, let's call it? Headgear. Headgear was very different. They didn't use French hoods. Instead, they used a couple of other things that actually varied, like a lot of them would use a wide beret with an upturned brim for women, in imitation of how men wore hats at the time. Men also had berets like that. It varied. We don't see that with Rhaenyra, though, because it's the books say she braided her hair. So I think they mixed this by having Rhaenyra's followers braid their hair like she does. We'll see. But apart from headgear, neckline. The neckline had this unique separate piece in Holy Roman Empire style called a partlet, also called a Galler in German. It's a collar. A partlet was sort of like a sleeveless mini half vest that covered the distance between the actual neck and the neckline of the gown itself. And these usually had a V-shaped collar to them, folded back sometimes. Like you could have this folded back collar on it. It's a few of these are features from late medieval, some aren't, but when we get to waistline, the Holy Roman Empire style retained a high waistline for a long time. And the Low Countries even more so. They kept it the longest, even more than Germany. And now we get to a key one. A very distinctive feature that Germany and the Low Countries had in the early 1500s, which was not a continuation of late medieval fashions, but something new entirely, is that they developed open-fronted gowns. Not just the kirtle peeking out here and there at the edges like the cuffs, but it was more like a jacket worn over the kirtle. Open-fronted gowns that would lace together in the front, but the two sides never actually touching. And it wasn't just normal lacing that they connected with, like, oh, I'm lacing together my jacket or something. It was this highly decorative, really wide band of rich fabric. It was this huge, special fancy lace in the front. In contrast, in the Spain, France, England, Tudor style, they just lace up the sides under the arm, and the laces aren't like a display or anything. They're functional. You're not really supposed to see them. Your arms go over them. So really elaborate lacing in the front, holding the gown together like a jacket over the kirtle. Also, narrow sleeves were common in the Holy Roman Empire style. Sort of a holdover from late Middle Ages, I guess, but consider that in contrast, the Spain Tudor style was famous for having really huge sleeves, cuffed at the wrist but flared below, showing off all the layers underneath. Germany didn't do that. That explicitly, sometimes the late Middle Ages would have a wider sleeve. Like I said, sleeves are a little more variable, but Germany, Low Countries, you're much more likely to find tight at the wrist sleeves, narrow sleeves, compared to the huge sleeves you'd see at the English court or the Spain court. So that's Holy Roman Empire style in the early Reformation period, early 1500s. So as you can see, Rhaenyra's style seems to be loosely inspired by the real-life Germany Low Country style, Holy Roman Empire style, as if to set her in opposition to Alicent's style. These are two contemporary styles from the early 1500s, the two big styles in all of Western Europe. And she put them on opposing sides. Rhaenyra, let's go down the checklist. Rhaenyra has prominent decorative lacing in the front, a relatively high waistline, narrow sleeves that fit her arm to the wrist, and a high V-shaped neckline with a collar that folds. It's not exactly like a partlet because the historical partlet was a separate piece altogether, but this is connected to her gown, but it follows the overall outline or silhouette. And this is even more clear when you see side-by-side comparisons with historical paintings I looked up on the Wikipedia pages going, this is an example of Reformation-era Germany style. Side-by-side with Rhaenyra, you go, this is clearly based on that. What you're looking at here is Katarina Luther, wife of Martin Luther. That Martin Luther's wife dressed like this, and this looks a lot like what Rhaenyra is wearing. And these other examples here I'm going to show. And you can see going through it, it's the V-shaped neckline with this turned collar and this very prominent special wide decorative band lace holding together the gown like a jacket. Late Middle Ages didn't do anything like that. That is a new innovation they did. And that's something we very clearly see on Rhaenyra, and she's got these decorative dragon claws holding the laces together. The end result of this is that, loosely speaking, Alicent's costume seems inspired by Catholic style, as we might call it, from the early 1500s, a mix of late medieval and Tudor, or rather, because it's all a political mess-up under Henry VIII. Rather, it's what was popular at the royal court of England at this time, but the fashions originated in Spain and France. While in contrast, Rhaenyra's costume seems more vaguely inspired by, let's call it, Protestant style, from Germany, the Netherlands, and so forth. Rhaenyra's outfit doesn't follow historical influences quite as closely as Alicent's does, admittedly. But at first, when we were all discussing this, we thought, wow, is this like a modern jacket that Tamim put in here? It's not modern. It's a little more exaggerated and played with variation on Germany style. That Holy Roman Empire style, that looking through historical costuming guides, I realized Rhaenyra's outfit here wouldn't look too out of place in Amsterdam in the year 1520. There are differences, but some of the general features are there mixed and matched. So ultimately, we're faced with one more final question. Why did Jani Tamim choose this contrast? I actually think it was just to set Alicent and Rhaenyra apart from each other, with roughly contemporary designs, but with no higher symbolic meaning. I don't actually think it's some sort of commentary on Catholicism versus Protestantism. And indeed, and let me underscore this, I actually think the real contrast is simply between England versus not England. That within the fictional story, the Targaryens are foreigners to Westeros. They only conquered and united the Seven Kingdoms about 1 century before House of the Dragon starts. Meanwhile, Alicent's family, House Hightower, are the rulers of Old Town, which for centuries was the largest city in Westeros, center of trade, education, religion, culture. That the Faith of the Seven is still headquartered in Old Town in this time period. King's Landing was built in the aftermath of the Targaryen conquest. King's Landing has only existed for 100 years. Whereas Old Town is the seat of the High Septon, their version of the Pope. The Citadel is there, where the Maesters are headquartered. It's the only university in Westeros. So, if you're looking for a family that represents the purest flower of indigenous Westerosi nobility, of their noble families, before the Targaryen conquest, the Hightowers would be one of the topmost. Yes, there's the Arryns, the Lannisters, great houses that rule their own kingdoms, or ruled their own kingdoms. But the Hightowers ruled Old Town for just as long, if not longer, for many centuries, going back into the mists of time. And arguably, they're more powerful than some of the weaker great houses. Younger Hightower brothers, nephews, and cousins become the High Septon so often that it's almost treated as a hereditary office. So the Hightowers are almost like the Borgias in Italy. So by any measure, Old Town is the heartland of indigenous Westerosi culture, Andal culture with the Faith of the Seven and knighthood and chivalry, and House Hightower are the rulers of Old Town. You don't get more Westerosi than the Hightowers, while the Targaryens are really newcomers. And Westeros is basically a supersized Britain. They say it's Britain as a continent the size of South America, according to George R. R. Martin. So someone who is from the cultural heartland of Westeros, which is this analog of Britain, should logically dress in a costume that looks very traditionally English, South England. You're talking London, the heartland of England, the type of thing. That their England analog, the Hightowers wouldn't really wear foreign-looking stuff for such an England-inspired fantasy setting. Like, if you're going to go, oh, well, the Lannisters were imitating the Targaryens under Cersei, so that's why the Lannisters look kind of Japanese-inspired, because they're copying the Targaryens. That was an idea Clapton had. It wasn't the worst idea, but the Hightowers would never do that. The Reach is straightforward, classic Western Europe, medieval England, and you don't get more part of the Reach than the Hightowers. The Tyrells are newcomers, they're upjumped stewards. The Hightowers have been ruling the largest city on the continent in their cultural heartland since the mists of time. So it makes sense that if you're going for late medieval to early Reformation costume designs, accepting it as a given that's the time period you're looking at, to ground it in reality, and your setting is a fantasy analog of Britain and broadly some parts of Europe, it makes sense that Alicent Hightower dresses in what we consider a stereotype of English style, to the point that it reminds us almost of Anne Boleyn. She looks like the stereotypical Tudor Rose, which is ironic, given that Olivia Cooke is from Oldham, up in the north. But I get ahead of myself. So once you take that into account, this all pretty much writes itself. Westeros is Britain. Hightower's one of the oldest and most distinguished families. They dress like English royals, not Celtic like the Wildlings or Viking-inspired stuff like the Ironborn. And once you make that decision, you simply set Rhaenyra's style in opposition to, well, she should look like something that isn't classic Tudor style or a mishmash of Tudor and late medieval. And what was the other big style in Europe at the time? There were only really two big styles that were widespread. The Spain, France, England style that stuck in England even though they weren't Catholic anymore. And Holy Roman Empire style from across Germany through the Low Countries. So I don't really think it has anything to do with Protestant versus Catholic. It's just these were the two styles that were in Europe at the time. One is the England one. Rhaenyra and the Targaryens should logically be the not England one. They're foreign to that continent. That's my theory anyway. But I'd love to ask Janie Tamim herself, what her exact motivations and influences were. I look forward to the interviews we'll get from her as Season 1 kicks off. But this is what we can glean from the two promo photos we have so far, and it's not much. Alicent seems to be wearing an English style between these two periods, around 1490-ish. Rhaenyra loosely inspired by rival fashions from Holy Roman Empire, just to contrast the two of them. I hope we get to see more of this, like other costumes. These probably aren't the only gowns they wear. We haven't even seen all of what Alicent's costume looks like. We haven't seen the bottom parts of it, or the sleeves or anything. So does the rest of this look like a mishmash of Tudor and some other things? We shall see. I hope you've enjoyed this documentary. I know it's long, but this is defining the visual aesthetic for an entirely new prequel era, for an entirely new show. This isn't just reviewing, hey, here's some new costumes in Season 6. This is an entirely new show in a different time period by different creators. Entirely new team is working on this. And we're trying to parse out just this entirely new experience of Westeros. What will it look like? Because we are kind of breaking away from Benioff and Weiss's version of this, and it's run by, real writers now, going down the level of, like, what would everything look like visually just because it's a new team, and thinking out, well, it's a prequel era, it's 200 years ago. So please, I'll be covering all of this other info as soon as it comes out. We get teaser trailers and more promo photos, and I will be making short follow-up reaction videos to, wow, this is what, like, Rhaenys Velaryon looks like when we finally get a photo of her, and this is what I think her costuming does. So I'll be referring back to this video, but with, like, short updates of, like, 10 minutes whenever we get a photo of a new cast member in full costume of, oh, this is what the Tywin Lannister might look like, or Joanna Lannister, and how the other blacks and greens are copying Rhaenyra and Alicent. So I'm going to be covering all this as we move forward. News will only pick up. They're actively filming now, and we will get more location spy photos when they film in Spain in October, which is coming up pretty fast in the grand scheme of things. So please like and subscribe if you want to get more updates about this, because not a lot of channels are really covering it.